Hello, I'm Debbie Doyle. I'm the meetings coordinator at the American Historical Association, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on History PhDs in the World of Entrepreneurship, which is part of the AHA Colloquium series of Virtual AHA. We're excited to have you join us today and are looking forward to a productive discussion. I would like to thank our generous sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. Programming such as these webinars relies on the support of the AHA's membership. If you're already a member, thank you for your support. If you're not a member, you might be interested to know that we have discounted rates for graduate students and early career historians. A few logistical things to consider to cover before we start the webinar. By registering for or participating in the AHA's webinars, participants and panelists agree to abide by the AHA's Code of Professional Conduct. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions to the presenters. The panelists will have some discussion amongst themselves before we move to audience questions. We hope to address all relevant questions, but want to be mindful of the time, so we may paraphrase or combine questions. It's fine to live tweet this webinar, and if you'd like to be a part of the conversation on social media, please remember to use the virtual AHA hashtag. Finally, a quick reminder that the webinar is being recorded, and we'll share a recording on the AHA's YouTube channel sometime after this session. I'd now like to turn the conversation over to the chair of the session, Edward Balleisen at Duke University. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Debbie. I'm going to just start off by sharing my screen. We have just a very, very brief set of slides for people to have a look at. And maybe begin just by noting that I'm thrilled to have the hosting us today. And just very much looking forward to the conversation. So let me begin with just a few framing comments. We have a great set of panelists today. I'm just going to introduce them briefly and then offer some framing remarks. So we have Tworek, who's the Chief Operating Officer from Venture for America. Jacqueline Olich, Vice President for University Collaborations at RTI International. Heather Miller, Principal Historian and Vice President for Business Development at Historical Research Associates. And Michael Tworek, CEO and founder of two Edtech startups, Cambridge Humanities Group and now Polis. Historians have always worked outside of the academy. They've worked for firms, corporations, startups, small businesses. They've worked for NGOs. They've worked in government agencies. This has been the case for the last 100 years. But if you think about the developments since the most recent financial crisis in 2008, the situation has shifted in a notable way. This is a graph from the AHA showing advertised job openings compared to the number of new history PhDs across the last roughly 40 plus years, almost 50 years. And as you can see, there was a really significant pronounced gap in the mid-1970s, somewhat similar to what we're encountering more recently. But in the intervening decades, there was a degree of balance between the number of PhDs produced and the number of academic job postings. Not so since 2008. So I think what we see with this development is a not necessarily completely unprecedented, but a really marked and sustained mismatch between that number of history PhDs and the number of faculty positions. And I think what we're now seeing as well is that the magnitude and duration of this mismatch has prompted wider interest in career diversity across the profession. I want to underscore that the American Historical Association has really led the way on this issue for many years, engaging in the analysis of academic and non-academic job markets that have produced visualizations like the slide that I just showed. Commissioning and disseminating reports on the status of PhD programs and the experiences of PhD students. Applying for and receiving grant funding from the Mellon Foundation and other funders to seed experimentation by PhD programs across the country, and convening representatives from those departments to share ideas, findings, and best practices, holding career diversity institutes for directors of graduate studies and other faculty members, creating a clearinghouse to match current students to potential mentors in many walks of life, and establishing and refreshing online resources for PhD students and faculty. If you're interested in these topics, I would just urge you to have a look at the career diversity page on the AHA website, which is just filled with really helpful resources. The focus of today's discussion is the role that many history PhDs have played within the world of entrepreneurship. Now, there are many important contexts for this discussion. Corporations, consulting, and startups, to be sure, but also non-governmental organizations, and for some entrepreneurially minded historians, positions within academic administration. For some time now, AHA has been tracking where historians work. The roughly 8,000 individuals who received history PhDs in the United States between 2004 and 2013, around 1 in 7 have been identified as working in the private sector or for an NGO. So this is not a small number of people. I'm thrilled that we're joined today by 4 holders of a history PhD who have key roles as innovators in firms or NGOs. I'd like to just again introduce them now. Elizabeth Brake earned her PhD in American policy and business history from Duke University, where I had the great pleasure of working with her as an advisor. Serves as I mentioned, Chief Operating Officer for the non-governmental organization Venture for America. Heather Miller earned her doctorate from the Ohio State University in comparative women's history. She now serves as Vice President for Business Development and Principal Historian at Historical Research Associates, a firm. Jacqueline Olich, who holds a PhD in Russian history from UNC Chapel Hill, is now Vice President for University Collaborations at RTI International. And finally, Michael Tworek, who earned his PhD in early modern European history from Harvard, and who is still an affiliate of the Harvard History Department, is founder and CEO of these 2 EdTech startups that I mentioned earlier. So we're going to start with some questions for the panelists, and we're going to transition to a mix of follow-ups and questions from the audience. But I'd like to begin actually with 2 audience polls, and I think we're going to launch them simultaneously. The first poll asks those of you who decided to join us today just to let us know who you are, what position you hold at the moment. The polls are anonymous. You don't. Second poll, which I think is going to go up right away as well, asks you for just to explain what your chief motivation is for spending 90 minutes with us today. So we're gonna put those 2 polls up. I think maybe one and then the other, and then the sense of who's out there. Just wait, say 30 seconds or so for people to do the first one. We have a question from the audience. I would say if in that case, I would working outside academia. And I think actually we should just collapse those first 2. They were supposed to go together. So just ignore PhD holder and put PhD, just put working outside academia if you are a PhD holder working outside academia. Would just draw everyone's attention to the chat. There are a few of our participants who are offering some, I think, very important context for their current situations. So do we have the poll results on that first one? So over a third current PhD students, and then quite a mix across the other categories. So that's about 12% faculty members, 1 in 5 working outside of academia. So that's very helpful. Victor, could you launch the second poll? So we have the second poll is also now coming through. I have to scroll down to see it. So almost half of the individuals have suggested that they are exploring career options outside of academia. A little more than 10% advising, mentoring graduate students wanting more information about career options. And about a similar number who are trying to figure out whether or not to pursue a graduate degree in history. So those are the main categories. Quite a large number of other. And so again, feel free to put some of those other reasons into the chat if you would be willing to share. So let's get going with the conversation. I'd like to begin by inviting each of our participants just to describe a little bit what you do and how you got to where you are. And let's, Elizabeth.
Hi, thank you, Ed, and hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here today. So as Ed said, I am the Chief Operating Officer of a nonprofit called Venture for America, and just a brief blurb on what that is. We are a post-undergraduate fellowship program where we connect recent college graduates who are interested in becoming entrepreneurs or working in startups, and we connect them to startups in 14, 13 cities across the United States that are cities that are not what you think of as the typical startup hubs, but rather cities that may be undergoing economic transition and who have growing or burgeoning entrepreneurial ecosystems. So I'm based in Cleveland, Ohio, and this is one place where we place fellows: New Orleans, St. Louis, Baltimore. So those are the kinds of cities you want to think about when you think about Venture for America. At VFA, currently what I do is run our operations, but also some of the things you might think of as the inputs into the fellowship program. So I'm particularly in charge of the finance team and the operations work that we do. I've also worked very closely with our community partnerships team, which are people who live and work in our cities and who do a lot of our business development work. They get companies to hire our fellows to understand why they should and what the value of that is, fundraising as well as fellow support. And I came up through the organization, through that team, doing that work and then leading some of our business development work as a function, and now leading the operations side. I got here through kind of a circuitous route. When I graduated from my undergrad, I went home to a family business in North Carolina. We were farmers and we were attempting a new business model for how we might make money with that farm. And so I was running that part of the business for about 5 years. And then I went to graduate school. While I was in graduate school, I had a number of side hustles and opportunities to stretch my legs and try some different skills and pick some things up. And then did a postdoc at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke, where I was specifically employed in the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. and was teaching in the Duke I&E program. I was teaching a history class there, but also studying how very large organizations do entrepreneurship and innovation inside their businesses. So it kind of took me to where I am, but building on an interest in how humans take an idea and turn it into something in real life, which to me is what entrepreneurship is.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Heather.
I need to unmute. Hi, I'm Heather Miller. I work for Historical Research Associates. I'm in our Seattle office. HRA is an interesting firm. It says historical, but we actually are both a cultural resources management firm. So that includes archaeology, historic preservation, and a history firm. So HRA has been around since 1974, was founded by a historian originally, and has really morphed into this kind of two-headed things. So just quickly, the way historians in this company work on the cultural resources management side, or CRM as we call it, they are mostly architectural historians. We have 5 or 6 on staff now, and so working with historic preservation in the sense of the Section 106 section of the National Historic Preservation Act. So when projects need environmental review or have to go through the Section 106 process, that's one of the things that they look at is above ground resources. On the history side of the house, we do all forms of history, but most of it's pretty land-based. So you can kind of think of it as environmental history, tribal resources history, water rights, and various things related mostly to environmental litigation and cleanup. And we also do administrative histories, or what we would call organizational histories. So everything from the Corps of Engineers to, for instance, we're doing one right now on the American Society of Addiction Medicine. And then we also have a very strong practice in what many of you know as public history, or the forward-facing side of history in terms of interpretive museum exhibits, interpretive signage, digital presence for historic narratives for the public. So I am the Vice President of Business Development, which was something I kind of got thrown into because nobody teaches you how to market in a PhD program. Figuring out how to win contracts and get us out there in front of everybody. And then I also work as a historian still. I've worked on both sides of the house since I came here in 2005. The way I got here also is circuitous, and I think that that's going to end up kind of being the story for a lot of us. I did go to graduate school pretty much knowing that I didn't want to teach, but I really wasn't sure what that meant. You know, you kind of just assume when you do a PhD program that you're going to end up teaching, and you don't really think that there might be other options, or at least I didn't when I entered in the mid-90s into graduate school. But serendipitously was made managing editor on the Journal of Women's History for 4 years. As a graduate student, where I picked up a lot of editing skills, I also had a side hustle as a copy editor, and I still do. I've been doing that for a long time. And then I got hired as an acquisitions editor for the Ohio State University Press, acquiring history books and language literary studies books. And when I went on the job market, I just didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I was set up to do my 5 AHA interviews. And then my current colleague, the president of HRA, called me up and said, hey, we have a job opening here at HRA. Would you be interested in applying? We had a mutual friend who knew that I was kind of searching. And I was like, well, what does a history consultant do? I literally didn't have much of a clue. Although I had also been doing some historical research on the side, I didn't really realize that there were companies that did that. So anyway, I applied and I got the job. I was a little surprised, but I moved to Seattle and I've loved it ever since, haven't looked back. So that's how I got it.
Thanks so much, Heather. Let's go to Jackie next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie Olich from RTI International. I joined RTI International, which is a very large nonprofit, mission-driven research institute headquartered in the Research Triangle Park, actually the cornerstone tenant of the Research Triangle Park, back in 2014 to be the founding director of the Office of University Collaborations. So it's kind of a startup within this giant organization. So to give you a sense of scale, RTI has more than 4,000 staff working on more than 3,000 projects at any moment in time, bringing in more than $900 million in revenue. And germane to our discussion, RTI has 492 PhDs in 125 disciplines, and you're looking at the history PhD at RTI. So today I'm the Vice President of University Collaborations, and in my current role, I manage and develop strategy and partnerships with leading universities. I lead the University Collaboration Office, which is the hub of RTI's engagement with universities, and we seed collaborative teams with our institution and other institutions in strategic areas. We oversee a visiting scholars program. We oversee the internship program, which I think Ed and I will share a little bit more information about later. And we hosted RTI had over 125 interns last year. And we also kind of attract and monitor university co-investments at the Institute. And just right now, for example, RTI has a joint research portfolio just with its special founding North Carolina partners of over $61 million. So how did I get here? I guess in reflecting for today, I could go back to when I was a tween and I established honor roll babysitting and realized I could charge more money with my name. And I worked with my dad. My dad is a first generation immigrant, and a first generation college student, an immigrant from the former Yugoslavia. And my dad and I co-founded a medical diagnostics company before I even started college. And I was involved in that from 1986 to 2004. And by the time we sold to a multinational Halma Technologies in 2004, we had two locations and over 100 employees. So like many entrepreneurs, I decided what I wanted to do was not go into completely take over the family business when my dad retired, but get a doctorate in modern Russian and East European history. So I entered the PhD program at UNC Chapel Hill to work with Don Raleigh, and I aspired to live a life of the mind. I loved studying all the changes that were going on in the Soviet Union as it was dismantling and becoming Russia, and all the changes that were going on globally. So I didn't really intend to be in a history department. But then also in 2000, when I finished up, I didn't really want to spend time in Putin's Russia either. So what I did was I transitioned to a kind of a hybrid graduate school faculty in the area studies part of UNC Chapel Hill in the Russian East European studies. And I administered the FLAS fellowships. I led outreach. I was a member of the graduate faculty in the Masters in Russian East European Studies curriculum. So that really was a bridge position for me. And then that, taught me how to work with an advisory board, that taught me how to write and administer grants, that taught me how to forge partnerships, how to use social media. I participated in the UNC Faculty Entrepreneur Bootcamp. I took a financial accounting class at Keenan Flagler. I broadened my professional development network, and that is what prepared me for the opportunity when it became available at RTI.
Thanks so much, Jackie. And finally, Michael.
Thanks so much, Ed, and thanks everyone for being here. I guess the way I describe my current employment is I often say now I'm an academic entrepreneur, meaning 80% of the time I spent on my startups and 20% of the time I spent on academic pursuits. So, 20% of the time I still work on my research on early modern Europe, history of education, I still teach. And then 80% of the time I run 2 startups. So my first one, Cambridge Humanities Group, or CHG, actually was founded at the AHA in 2018. So that's a nice little fun fact, which I started as a talent agency for academics, connecting academics with extra academic teaching. And since 2018, it really took off. We ended up having over 500 educators on our roster. We've connected with programs in China, Poland, Mexico, all different ones across the world, and we basically vet them. So that was one of the nice kind of aspects of that startup, really to turn it from something online to something digital. And then just recently, in the middle of 2020, we decided to spin off a new venture, an Edtech Venture called Balleisen, which is our digital marketplace to connect educators with students and to really personalize learning. And this is something we're actually launching officially next month in February, which I'm very excited to talk about if someone would be interested. I guess key stepping stones that led me towards this, I guess, or how I got to it would be, I guess, in some sense, the job market for early modern Europe and a two-body problem. All jokes aside, it was really, I guess, a couple of two really kind of key things that really pushed me. First, getting started, really getting kind of solicited by companies when I was finishing my PhD, education companies who had seen, oh, he had previous teaching experience. Maybe this person in the Boston area can help us find educators for our programs or educators to help advise on our edtech technology. In doing that, basically, I realized that a lot of these companies, a lot of these edtech education companies were actually sometimes more travel companies and more tech companies rather than education companies. And then the other really important thing that really launched me into becoming an academic entrepreneur, I would say, is getting kind of foisted into the management consulting recruiting process, which was extraordinarily enjoyable. It was really great. And one of the biggest insights that made me realize is that historians can be valued in the business world, especially wined and dined and really kind of seen as valuable assets. And I think the other thing that really also helped in that validation process is that I realized I could learn everything that an MBA knows or should know about business, and I could offer more. And in doing that, I realized there was a gap for someone like me as a historian in the sphere of both education and entrepreneurship. So that's how I got here, essentially.
So if I think about some of the thematic threads across these 4 accounts that you've just all offered, and thank you very much for that last one, Michael. One is the degree to which you've had to pivot subsequent to having the PhD and the sorts of skills that you've had to develop subsequent to that initial training to be able to take full advantage of the opportunities that you've had. I wonder if we could hear from you now a little bit about the ways in which your historical training has actually equipped you effectively for the roles that you have outside of academia. And maybe let's start with Heather this time.
Sorry, I gotta do that. I think that what I would call the historian's toolkit is something that really did equip me to be in the position. Now, of course, I do work as a historian, researching and writing, which of course are the traditional historian's toolkit, right? So the ability to conduct research, to document that research in a very rigorous way, to be able to analyze lots of documents and create narrative threads out of that in the context in which you're writing. And then being able to obviously write that in a way that is readable and usable for your audience. Now, of course, our audience is not other historians. We're not just speaking within a group of people that are doing the same thing we are doing. We're speaking to attorneys, we're speaking to the general public, we're speaking to clients who have much different needs. And so, sort of figuring out where that interface has been, that might be a little bit of a pivot, sort of figuring out how to write for different people who aren't just either going to be figuring out how to tear you down or mine your footnotes for whatever it is that they are looking for. But yeah, so just really being able to present that in a way that's useful. So. what else? I think also the ability to speak in public, like conference presentations, was something that I really learned through graduate school, sort of like being forced into these really uncomfortable situations and sort of getting that to be not uncomfortable, because we're constantly public facing with clients and things like that. So that's been really useful. And I just think sort of having this broader sense of the world and in which we live in, and this continuum in which we are on historically.
Jackie, thoughts from you on this?
I would echo many of the comments that that Heather shared. In preparing and thinking about this question, it was actually trickier than I thought, because it's just such a part of who I am and how I think wherever I am. But I would say facilitating discussions is something that I learned from TAing that I use every day, for sure. Who's quiet in the room, who needs to be called upon, how to lead an inclusive discussion, forming arguments, appreciating context, presenting, as Heather said. But key for me is processing and making sense of tremendous amounts of information, and also interrogating various sources. Usually I'm always cautious if I have one source of information, it might be a jaundiced source. I always want to kind of double check that or get some other sources. Understanding what's important, making sense of things. The other thing I thought that was interesting, I was talking with a colleague this morning in preparation and talking about how I was going to be discussing this today. And I said, how do you see me as a historian interacting with me? And she said, the way that I craft narratives, even when I write performance reviews. And so I thought that was really telling as well. So all those things.
Thanks for that. Michael.
So I think I definitely second everything that's been said by Heather and by Jackie on the skills that we bring. There's so many, but I think for me, two in particular stand out about the value of being a historian of history to what I'm doing. The first area is definitely knowledge, in the sense that insights from my own research on the history of education is pretty much what inspired me with this new venture that we started. My own research on the early modern Republic of Letters, serving as inspiration for founding a new Republic of Letters for the 21st century, drawing insights from how people have tried to teach and learn for over 2,000 years from my own work. When someone asked me, well, what is your data? What are your data points for, making sure that this is something new? It was like, well, I don't have 50 years of data. I have 2,000 years of data from my research. So that's the first way, knowledge. Actually, the knowledge that we know can be extremely useful and applicable. Now, I would say the second thing that's really important, that's more skill-based, is, in a sense that, having taught history and being a teacher for almost now 15 years, from being a high school Latin teacher to having taught all the way up through the university level, realizing what really works really well, really especially one-on-one interactions, office hours, and those things, actually those pedagogical skills inspire me also in the founding of this recent company in particular, where, when we ask, in a business, what really matters, is it really the revenues, the profits? Yes, of course, those matter, but also especially if you're involved in education, this is something I've acquired through history, is realizing, these experiences in teaching, which can be models for how you implement something to offer something new to people who don't have that or haven't realized that. So for me, the actual teaching perspective and the formats I encounter are important.
Thanks, Michael. Elizabeth.
Yeah, I feel like this is a nice layer cake that we're building, because again, like many of the things that Heather and Jackie and Michael have said really resonate. I think in the nonprofit context, for me specifically, there are a couple things that have been really helpful. One is just the ability to write a really strong grant. If there's a single real skill that you learn in graduate school beyond the skills of your field, it's how to write a grant. And that is really how I made my living at VFA, especially in the first 2 to 3 years that I was here. And so, just being really good at that, but being able to write them in an evidence-based way that is focused on outcomes. Because I think when you're proposing to someone else to support your nonprofit, you need to be able to say to them, here's the data for what we've done, and here's what you can expect us to accomplish to help you reach your goals and the change you want to see in the world. And this is how you know we're going to be a good partner with you. And so that is a real skill that I think is specific to being a historian as well, as being able to craft that narrative and bring that data from observation to causation. The other thing I think is also just really being immersed in the context of your own work, and Venture for America is a piece of an ecosystem, and there are, we're in 13 cities and there are 13 unique ecosystems in those where we work, and we are a piece of that is really connecting lots of other organizations and connecting lots of different people to different organizations, and then being able to see from a high level, what is the role that we play in that space? What does it mean to be in a city and to have Venture for America there, and what are we accomplishing? And I'm actually I'm leading an impact assessment process that we're doing at the moment, where I'm not doing the research, but I'm working with 4 external teams who are academics and enabling them to do that research, and being able to give them the context and give them the questions that we need answered, and able to elicit the kind of feedback and results that I need back from them in order to move into our next 10 years and a new strategic planning process. I don't know that I would feel nearly as able to do that work were I not trained as a historian. So very specifically useful in that case.
I'm wondering if we could shift a little bit now towards rethinking the experience of graduate education in the context of preparation for the sorts of careers that you all have been able to forge for yourselves. And you've been able to do it having been trained in a context that was not really focused on the question of how to prepare people for positions other than those within the academy. And I'm mindful as well that there's an argument that the careers that you've all developed are powerful indications that you don't necessarily need to change doctoral education in order for people to be able to find their way in avenues outside of the academy. Nonetheless, I really would. There's a lot of thinking going on, and I think appropriately so, about how graduate education might be different, or how, even without changing structures, students might think differently about the way they navigate the program. So I'm going to suggest a kind of lightning round, a couple lightning rounds. So the first would be just one suggestion from each of you for either a current graduate student navigating their program. Which is one piece of advice you have for how to make the most of that to keep options open? Or alternatively, a suggestion for a PhD holder who's thinking about career options. And that might be wanting a change. It might be just thinking about what they want to do right out of getting the PhD. And if you really want to give one for each, that's fine. But I want to do a second lightning round and then maybe open it up to questions from the audience. So let's reverse the order a bit, and Michael, you get to go first.
So I would say my suggestion for graduate students, and this is based on something that I wish looking back in retrospect, wish could have done, is take courses outside of your department. And I don't mean necessarily, if you're a historian, take a course in English, but seriously getting outside of the social sciences and humanities, and say maybe if your university you have a business school or statistics or something quite different, which you can potentially use as a springboard towards maybe an alternative career path. I had a friend in grad school who studied engineering, but decided also to take business courses as well at the business school at her university. And over the course of 5 years, in addition to becoming a fantastic engineer, she also acquired all these skills that enabled her also to transition to a more management administrative level position rather than an engineering one. And I thought to myself, I wish I was she's far smarter than I am, but I wish I had done that. So that's one suggestion I would give to graduate students.
Jackie.
My advice for graduate students would be to learn how to manage a budget, a conference budget, a travel budget, a student group budget, a department budget in Excel.
Elizabeth.
Oh, +1 on the Excel. But I also just like say yes to the side hustles. When opportunities come along, don't be scared of them. You will have to manage your time and do a really good job of continuing to stay on top of what you might consider your primary work, which is your coursework or your dissertation, but find the time.
Heather.
So you guys all, said exactly what I would say. So I think the thing that was mostly missing from my PhD program was any sense that our time was worth money. That there's this disconnect in academia where your work is supposed to be unsullied somehow by, remuneration. We're just supposed to toil as long as we can and never really put those two together. And I feel like that's doing us a real disservice in terms of being able to value what is your time worth, and therefore what should you be getting paid if you're out in the world trying to make a living as a consultant or something like that. And then that all ties into exactly what everyone else has said is I wish that I had taken a business class. I wish that I had taken a business accounting class, and I wish that I had taken some sort of marketing or business development class. I think those things, though I've been playing catch up with that for the past 20 years. And so I agree completely with what everybody else said.
I'm struck by a kind of implicit theme in these comments. Maybe we could just dig into it for a second. And the notion of do the side hustle, really important to do the side hustle. I kind of hear you, Elizabeth, pushing back against all the advice not to do that.
Yes.
That people tend to get.
I think it's really important. I mean, obviously everyone has to make their own decisions for themselves within the rules of their program and, their own priorities. But I finished my prelims in the spring of 2009. And I looked at the economy around me, and it was very clear to me that the odds of me becoming a history professor were pretty low, even if I did everything right. And so I felt that I needed to take control of my own education and my own trajectory. And, if I got to the end of graduate school and I hadn't built those skills, that to some degree that was on me. Now, we're going to talk in the next lightning round, I think, about like the advice for the programs themselves, and I have thoughts about that as well. But I think that graduate students should take the reins of their professional development.
One word that often comes up, I think, in this conversation within the domain of graduate programs is distraction. It's a word I am constantly hearing. And I find it quite ironic, actually, because if you imagine the academic trajectory, so you get a PhD, maybe a postdoc, you get an academic tenure track job somewhere. I think a lot of people who end up on that trajectory have a lot of shock in the first couple of years as they're trying to negotiate what it means to be a faculty member, because the demands are many and the expectations are great, and you have to juggle and you have to learn how to manage this project and that project and this responsibility and that obligation. And I myself, sort of shifting towards the next topic, I just worry about not preparing people well for that capacity to juggle and to engage in effective time management around multiple kinds of endeavors, because that's actually crucial to success in academia, not just outside of it. So let's go to that next lightning round. Since it is the case that many programs across the country are engaging in a level of self-examination that we haven't seen really for quite some time, what advice would you give to chairs of departments or directors of graduate studies or faculty members who are looking at their curriculum for the kinds of things they should be thinking about or the interventions that they might offer? And let's start with Elizabeth again this time.
Oh, I mean, similar to my feeling that you really should embrace the side hustle, I think that graduate programs should make space for that. And perhaps that's about carving out space, the expectation that you should be doing something like that in the summer in addition to research, or, giving some kind of credit for that, or just even actively making the connections. But I think that many graduate students feel that if you do those things, you have to keep it quiet. and that like you, above all else, your faculty should not know that you were doing that. And I was very fortunate to not have to do it that way, but I know lots of graduate students do. And so just recognizing that reality, you don't have to compromise on the standards of scholarship. And in fact, you should not, because it doesn't do anyone any good. But making space and making it expected that someone will be juggling those multiple things, and giving them some guidance rather than leaving them out there to do it by themselves, I think is incredibly important.
Heather.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the other thing is people have to live, right? I mean, I had, my tuition paid in that, and I was lucky I had a 0.75 FTE on my graduate, stipend or whatever it was. But that wasn't enough for me to live. And I had to work part-time outside. I worked as a reference librarian at the local public library, and in addition to side hustles. And so I think like this idea that everyone is actually able to even afford to not work on the side is not right. I would say that aside from the business things, and it's interesting, the committee work that you're talking about would be to sort of make students, if they're going the academic route, participate in committee work. And we would have people sometimes sit on committees, but actually sit in shadow. Like, how is the committee dealing with the budget? What kinds of policies are they dealing with? Those kinds of things. And then the other thing I would really emphasize, and I feel like historians, I'm not sure how it is now. I mean, obviously I've been out of school for a long time, but a collaborative project. So in our work, we work constantly with other historians, whether we're co-authoring a report. We don't always work in silos, and we have to work together. We have 20 historians on staff. We go on research trips together. We are constantly talking to each other about the work that we do. And I feel like in graduate school, you're almost set to like, you have to do your own thing, and you're like hoarding your stuff. And that's not at all how it is in the outside world.
So there's been a comment in the chat that's adjacent to this one, Heather, about the importance as well of getting exposure to work that is not just completely following your own agenda, but is responding to someone else's set of needs. Because I think outside of academia, it's almost all going to have that character.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times people will ask, well, don't you then just, aren't you then doing biased work because someone else is telling you what to do? I mean, I know we had earlier conversations where some people are handed their dissertation project, right? They don't necessarily get to choose that, but you need to be able to figure out how to do the work that they want you to do to provide the deliverable that they're paying you for. So you're absolutely right. I mean, we're responding to requests for proposals as opposed to going out to people and saying, hey, why don't we do this? So it's absolutely true.
Michael.
So I would say I would definitely agree and second what's been said so far. And I would say, part of the problem, especially someone who quite relatively recently came through this, is I would say it's a structural problem in the sense that there's still a stigma associated for doing these things, right? In reality, I know this also from the talent agency side, having seen also faculty members who do side hustles as well in order to supplement their faculty income. So, just really destigmatizing it. And I think one way that would be really helpful, whether within graduate cohorts or within departments, is to make a non-academic experience compulsory, so that everyone has to do it. So there is no stigma, hopefully. You limit any kind of penalty for that, essentially. And then, those who do actually go through and, succeed in getting an academic job, they have at least a non-academic experience, which can inform them moving forward, which would help with some of maybe the, sometimes it's generational, maybe it's sometimes training that, makes faculty unable to see the value of these non-academic experiences. And then, of course, if you have PhDs in your program who say, love their non-academic experience, an internship, a job, whatever it might be, you have someone that gets placed in a job right away. And then, in some ways it helps alleviate that. And then, the key thing, as I mentioned, these kind of compulsory things that eliminate the stigma of doing side hustles or internships or things that are not necessarily academic track related.
Thanks for that, Michael and Jackie. And I should say that we're going to pivot now to, after Jackie's comment, to questions that are now pouring in to both the Q&A and the chat. And I'm going to do my best to negotiate that. Jackie.
Okay, I'll hold back on responding to anything in the chat and I'll focus on the question at hand. In terms of my suggestion for faculty contemplating reform or changes or how to be supportive, two things. One, really accept, don't just say that you do, really accept that there's no single path to excellence. And then I would also say that everyone needs to differentiate between a historian's mindset and a historian's skill set.
Okay, that's you gotta have to say another sentence or two about that. So otherwise we're all going to be thinking about that for the next 5 minutes and not.
Well, in terms of like the mindset and the skill set, it's like you're teaching people skills on how to be a historian. You don't control what they decide to do with that knowledge that you teach them. Their career is their own. They don't need to replicate your path or follow one trajectory. So I think there's some humility there. How's that, Ed?
That's great. Okay, so I'm gonna start moving through the questions, and I'm gonna, if I see ones that overlap, I may combine them. But the first one is one about messaging and presentation. So for those of us still working through PhDs, how would you recommend we message our interest in non-academic positions to the public, even as we cultivate scholarly relationships and work on our dissertation? AKA, while we're juggling, how clear what our professional intentions are. And I think implicit in this is also perhaps, how do you do that to different audiences? Your faculty mentors, as well as employers or other people whom you might develop network relationships with. Anyone want to take that? Jackie.
I can take a shot at that one. First of all, I would, as a historian, question the assumption that you have to message everything to everyone and that your message is going to be the same. I think you can just be open. I'm open to ideas. I'm open to new opportunities. I'm curious. I want to learn more. You don't need to tell your dissertation advisor that you've decided to not pursue an academic career the second you come to that realization. I mean, you have to be honest in terms of getting a letter of recommendation or those kinds of things, but you don't have to tell your parents everything that you're doing. You don't have to tell your dissertation advisor everything that you're thinking. And you have a wide network. And then if you have a wide network, you can have different people give you recommendations or references that are more tailored to the opportunity.
There's a related question in the Q&A about how one conveys the pathway that may be nonlinear to employers. So that's another audience-based kind of question. And I guess I'm inclined to say that this is something that historians tend to be pretty good at. Let's think about finding a satisfying causal account to describe a disparate set of facts. But I'm wondering whether any of you have any thoughts about that.
I have a thought, actually. I think that we as historians, and this is a thing I had to learn when I deliberately chose to go look for other work, is that we need to be better at quantifying our impact and quantifying our impact in ways that are in the language of business. So, when you're speaking to other historians, to say I wrote a dissertation is to bring a great deal of underlying assumptions about what that means. And so another historian would understand the project management and the document management and all of the things that go into that, but other people don't know what that means. And so what you've done is you've conceived a project from start to finish with an outcome that looks like this. You've engaged a certain number of stakeholders. If you say you're doing more contemporary stuff where you can do oral history or something like that, but really think about what can you count and what can you count towards an outcome to really show what you can accomplish. Because I think an employer is less interested in, as long as you can tell your narrative of why their position is interesting to you, I think the fact that you took an unusual path is fine. But the only way they can know what you can bring to their business is if you can tell them what you've brought to other places already. you have to be able to speak to that impact. So just learn to think about your own work in those terms.
Heather, you wanna jump in there?
Well, yeah, and I'd like to say, I think it's kind of, and again, I've been out of graduate school for a long time, but I think in business, the circuitous route is not necessarily a bad thing. Like actually having a number of experiences that feed into who you are as a whole person coming to this particular job is fine. I think that the problem is this sort of sense in academia that you have to focus on one subject and one subject only, and you're going to take that through, you're going to be the expert on something. I find that, the historians that really succeed in consulting are the ones who throw that subject matter expert out, not completely, obviously, but and focus on the toolkit, which is what's the question? What are you trying to get at in your research, and how are you going to tell that story, and not being afraid to say, I mean, like my degree's in women's history, I do hydroelectricity, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, things that are completely outside of what I was trained to do or what I'm an expert in. And I think being okay with that is fine. And people who have a more well-rounded experience actually, I think, do better in those kinds of situations. They're more confident in their ability to shift gears and figure out how to do what needs to be done.
There are a couple of, I think, really important questions, link questions about mentorship. So one of them is, I'm gonna throw them out together, and then see if you want to answer one or both, those on the panel. So the first question is, could you talk a little bit about the significance of mentorship in your own pathway? And the second is just noting that at least for a couple of you, experiences before you even became PhD students were quite significant and formative in opening up what other avenues might look like. So from the perspective of a faculty member who's trying to help students who may not have had those experiences, any advice for how to help students build the foundation if they don't already have it already? And we've heard some suggestions: get outside of history, take some other kinds of courses, think about a non-academic experiential learning channel, perhaps. But I'm curious if you have others. I might have a few here too. Anybody want to take one or both of those questions to start off the Jackie?
I would say, respectfully, I saw the question in the chat. I would take another look at this and encourage a student to take another look at his or her experience. I was having a conversation not that long ago with some colleagues at a university who focus on encouraging entrepreneurship and innovation. And I said, I think the student that you have that grew up in a family that had a restaurant or had a nail salon where they worked all the way through high school might not see themselves in your definition. So I would say, look back. There's probably something that you can mine if you look at it through a different lens. And in terms of mentorship, I think mentorship and what I call ventorship, having a safe space where you could just vent to someone, like, can you believe what he just said in that meeting, or that pre-conference meeting in the ladies' room? Like, oh my gosh, okay, you're gonna say this, and then I'm gonna amplify what you just said. Like, those mentorship and ventorship relationships are key and help you really see what's going on around you in a different way. And we all have a responsibility to serve that role for others as we go forward now.
I also, to come back to the framing of entrepreneurship, I think mentors need to make space for failure, especially when you are exploring new ideas. If you're someone who hasn't, maybe you really haven't had any other work experience, and it was no working through undergrad straight into grad school, and this has been your path. Once you start to explore other things, it's scary, and you're going to explore things that are going to turn out not to be okay. And I think my experience of academia was that it did not celebrate failure, that failure was a thing to not publicize and to overcome as quickly as possible. But in fact, entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial thinking is an iterative process, and iterations imply in some ways failure and pivots to do the next thing. And so you're going to try things and they're not going to fit, and you're going to try on something else and it might not fit, and that should be okay. And mentors can make that space.
Michael.
Yeah, I would definitely second all of that. And I would say, one thing that might seem almost counterintuitive, especially in terms of finding mentorship or finding at least kind of support, is getting out of the historian echo chamber. I think that's really quite important. I remember in just even my own process going and realizing, at Harvard, there was a consulting club. There was a whole incubator, which basically invited everyone from the school to come in and join, irrespective of what school, where you could listen to people working on various ventures, and just surprisingly meeting a lot of non-historians. Because I think and this is true for any discipline, if you stay too much in one area, you tend not to kind of consider other points of view. And this is what I notice interacting now with a lot of developers, a lot of MBAs. They're like, wow, it's so cool to hang out with a historian, because we really didn't have a lot of contact with them before, and we have new perspectives. And I think that's the same thing that we can do as well as historians. Get out of our echo chambers. Don't get into a pattern of really just listening to the same kind of vicious cycle of thinking, perhaps keeps us from being creative and thinking in other options. Go and chat with someone else if you have that opportunity. That's the thing I really say. Get out of the echo chamber of historians. Sometimes it can be very, very refreshing.
So I would take it even a step further, Michael. So if you're thinking about the advice to the graduate student or to the faculty member advising graduate students, I'd put into the mix, encourage people to look for opportunities to do some collaborative work that's interdisciplinary, where the historian gets to demonstrate their expertise and be valued for that, but also gets to learn from the statistician or the political scientist or the engineer, depending on what the issue or question is. One of the powerful things about the evolution of higher education, especially in the United States, but in many other parts of the world as well, is that there are, at every university now, there are just a huge array of interdisciplinary centers and institutes that are engaged in a variety of different kinds of applied research. So, one opportunity here that is there for students and for faculty is to seek out those possibilities and to weave them into the fabric of what the training looks like, as a way of getting appreciation for what historians bring to the table, but also developing project management skills, thinking about how to reach different kinds of audiences, getting that exposure, as Emily Greenwald pointed out in the chat, to working on a project where you're not completely setting the agenda. I think that's another one. Heather.
Just really quickly too, on the mentorship thing, I guess it's this sort of idea that mentors don't have to replicate themselves. And I think this is what you're talking about, Michael, in this sort of echo chamber of history, that, why can't a mentor be asking their students, what do you want to do? What do you love? Like, what's going to get you up every morning? And, I like, for me, I love my job so much. I wake up every day, I come to work and I love my job. Yeah, sure, it has its ups and downs, but I have never once regretted my decision. But and my advisor, thankfully, was very supportive of, helping me in the publishing and these other things. She never once said, you have to, a tenure track job is the only way, or you failed me, right? Like, I feel like I got very lucky that way. I know other people, though, that did not have that experience. And I definitely suffered from a sense of failure when I did not go to my 5 AHA interviews and try to get a tenure track job. And when I took the HRA job for first couple of years, I talked to my graduate student friends who got, real jobs, and feel like I was at a disadvantage. I don't feel like that at all anymore. But I think that mentorship is like a parent. You don't try to force your kid to be something you want them to be. I mean, some people do, but you try to figure out, what do they love? What do they want to do? What's going to make them a happy, productive person? So I think that's more important.
It actually reminds me a little bit of personalized medicine, when you talk about what's right for that person, that kind of customization and personalization and advising and mentoring.
Yeah.
So
there was a comment that I really liked about having a mandatory class early on in one's career. graduate school career to explore, what are these other options?
So I just want to note that there's quite a lot of Twitter activity going on around this panel, which is great, but it's not all using the @virtualaha hashtag, which makes it a little follow. So I just want to encourage you to use that hashtag, at least if you want to have a cohesive conversation as we continue the conversation. A really interesting question in the Q&A about nuts and bolts. Could one or more of you just describe your typical workday? How much time is dedicated to work that an academic historian or a grad student would recognize, that research and writing, as opposed to other tasks, client consultation, managing a budget, project management, etc.? Who'd like to take a crack at that? Heather, then Elizabeth.
So one way to think about it that I don't think you ever learn in graduate school is at HRA and in most consulting companies that are working on a billable hour kind of structure, or even in a attorney setting, because we bill by the quarter hour to projects or to an admin, kinds of buckets. For instance, upper management in my case is sort of like, I'm trying to be 40% billable, and that means to an actual project. That could include spending a week in an archive somewhere. Obviously 2020, that hasn't been possible, but certainly our historians will often go on these long research trips, going through archives, going to libraries, going to different kinds of repositories. So that can happen. And then that, of course, would result in writing, sort of, hours spent on going through your information and writing. But then the flip side of that, the other 60% would be, in my case, working on business development. Right now, I'm in the middle of budgeting for our 2021 budget, all of our marketing efforts through, for the company. We do responding to proposals. So spending time going out there, looking for requests for proposals in the various outlets that you find those, and then making a go, no go decision and figuring out who's going to lead that proposal effort, putting the proposal and the budget together and that kind of thing. So managing that process, and there are times of the year when that really rises, sort of like the late summer, early fall, and we might be go, no going on 40, 50 things a week. So it's kind of a mix, and then having to juggle those things is sort of how we work our day out. But so from my perspective, it's about 40% historian, 60% admin. For people that are in more of a research position at HRA, their billability expectation might be 90%. So they're actually working on history projects 90% of their time.
Thanks, Heather. Elizabeth.
Yeah, my experience is quite different and has evolved over time. When I started at VFA and was when I was a community director and I was doing a lot of grant writing and a lot of on the ground work, I don't know, I probably spent a third to a half of my time writing, but that was grant applications, grant reports. It was not research in the sense that you might think of it. I don't really do very much research anymore and haven't in a long time. As I have moved through the organization, my duties have become more and more management. And so now I even do very little grant writing anymore. Someone asked me to write a grant report for them last week, and I was thrilled because I don't write much anymore. And I was really happy to just write that grant report and use that muscle again. But I do have the opportunity to work on the impact assessment and engage in conversation with those external academics who are working with us to frame questions and think about the things that they're finding and to provide them more information, to do feedback on drafts that I receive. And that work is collaborative and really interesting. It's also a very tiny piece of what I do. So at this point today, it's probably like 98% other stuff and 2% things you might recognize from your academic work.
Michael, you mentioned earlier that it's a different balance for you in part because you're keeping a hand in on the academic side.
Yeah.
I take it that seems like that's both because you enjoy it, but I think also because it sounds like it keeps you grounded in a way that's relevant for the business side of it as well.
Absolutely. And it's a huge, especially when I go either to investors or anyone I really work with from both sides of the startups, they see that as incredible value. It's like, oh, wow, I'm actually talking to someone who works on history, rights history, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a big kind of, it's both enjoyable for me, but also adds a lot of value to the people I work with. They're like, oh, wow, someone who actually knows history, tell me about it. So it's always a great way also to talk about what I work on. But for me, exactly, in order to be able to do that and also have free time, and also, now given the pandemic, find the right balance with scheduling my time with my wife's time as well, so that we don't have Zoom calls at the same time. It's very structured, it really is. On one day I have all finance stuff. One day, Wednesdays, usually I only do calls and meetings. I don't do calls and meetings for other days because it interrupts the flow for deep work. So I really try to compartmentalize. This is the time I'm dedicating for this particular venture at this time. This is for this other venture. This is when I have meetings. This is when I do certain non-deep work, and then I have time for deep work. And then before I even get started, especially since currently I'm on the West Coast, I have to subscribe to the tyranny of East Coast time, which means getting up very early. Is really to start the day with actually just some writing, and incorporate even free time in the afternoons when there are lulls to be able to do that. So I find myself actually really structuring my week and even weekends to do this. But when you have a goal in mind and you're really excited, and your weekend doesn't have to be your day off. A mid-afternoon on Wednesday or Thursday can be your day off. This is a luxury that you have when you're running your own business, but it also means that it gives you another kind of problem. You can take any day off, but you can't take every day off. And trying to find that structure and adding that, I think, is what helps for me. So it doesn't mean micromanaging the schedule, but scheduling what are do's and don'ts during the week, and what you do during those times.
Jackie, my sense pattern again is different.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Jackie, I was just wondering if you could comment a little bit on what your pattern is with respect to the sort of typical day.
Sure. Again, like I think everyone here, there's no necessarily typical day, but kind of similar to Heather at RTI, we're a government contractor. So we have kind of the total time management. We're a little bit like a law firm. We enter our hours, what we did with our hours during the day. And at first that was like culture shock when I transitioned from UNC. And then now I actually really like it because I can look back and kind of hold myself accountable. Like, how am I budgeting my time? What am I actually doing with my hours? So like some examples of things I did, I'll give you some examples of things I did this week with a nod toward Michael's comment that, virtual space is different than real space. We hosted, my team hosted and I took part in a Harvard student virtual site visit talking about opportunities at RTI. So I had that student piece this week that I would have had if I was at a university interacting with students. So that was fun. I worked on and refined a call that we're working on with RTI board members and some university partners for a large seed fund opportunity. And there's a section in the beginning where I needed to explain, as I say in Russian, like Zachem, like for what purpose, where is this coming from, the context and the history of the Research Triangle Park. So that definitely, I would say, was my history lens. I had a mentoring call, which I would do if I was at the university. Yesterday, I judged a pitch competition for a regional faculty and student. I was a judge for a regional student and faculty venture competition that we had. So I had that also, that student engagement. I meet with my team often, and we have checking in with different members of my team, particularly in this virtual space, often to make sure that they know what the priorities are and what they should be working on and what the strategy is and what's important. So I've done quite a bit of writing. So I would say that that's kind of a wide range of activities.
Thanks for that. We have a couple other questions that are asking for quite practical advice about how to execute on the recommendation that you've all made to get out of your comfort zone and to explore beyond the subfield, the discipline. So one of those questions is, how can we navigate to courses? This is clearly from a current student. How can we navigate to courses outside the PhD when the school is so strict with curriculum and timeline? And I'll throw out one option here. So, there's always pressing against the boundaries of the rule. So make a case. What is the reason that you X or Y or Z that requires an exception from? Now, the ideal would be a shift to the curriculum. But barring that, is there a way to press against it? If that's not an option, what's available to you outside of the curriculum? There are now 1 million MOOCs and other kinds of resources, workshops that are things that you can tap both within your university and beyond it. Michael, your head, yes. You want to offer any amplification there?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say, as someone who's working in this space, especially, I would say, I haven't actually been able to take, unfortunately, as I mentioned, any formal courses. That everything I've learned essentially has amounted to essentially a very quick MBA without having to pay for it, was done through precisely taking online courses, reading. A lot of it is going to be autodidactic, and that's okay sometimes. Sometimes you have to engage in that. And honestly, at some point, even if you transition to a non-academic career, even with that, a lot of what we do post-degree is autodidactic. You're going to be faced with a new challenge. And I think that's one of the strengths we have as a historian with a PhD, is that we can learn practically anything, whatever it might be, and embracing that. And that, if it means you read, you kind of pursue outside sources, extra, even free online courses. There's so much of that that's free. That's also a really good supplement. It doesn't necessarily have to be formal learning or a course per se, even though that is very helpful. But like Ed said, I think especially in the context of history, like taking a statistics course, for instance, which is so valuable, it's so applicable, especially afterwards, you could make a very strong case, because historians do use, many historians use statistics, right? So I think that's part of it. If you do pursue the formal, making a case, especially if there are restrictions, but ultimately being okay with being autodidacted about it, which I've done, and which was helpful, and was ways of getting around not having to pay necessarily for very expensive business courses. So that would be my suggestion. I mean, I remember I surveyed one of my seminars recently, and over 75% of the students in this continuing education seminar said to me that they use YouTube as their main source for continuing learning. And obviously it's hit and miss in terms of quality, but there are a lot of resources available for that, especially free ones, for augmenting your knowledge.
So the related question is asking for advice about, it's really related to how to build your network beyond your program or your university. I'd love to know how students can best leverage mentors who are not at their home institution when it comes time to secure recommendation letters or references. And this individual is writing a dissertation in food studies, which is not a formalized discipline at this individual's university. And so the individual has a number of mentors that have emerged through a whole set of side hustles. And yet, when she's then looking to put together an application for something, the expectation is committee members are the people who are going. Now, again, that might be something that you press against. Get in touch with the organization and say, no, actually, given my experience, it's really you're going to be better served hearing from at least one or two people who are not on my committee. But I would just throw this out to the panel as well with respect to strategy for building that network of mentors who may be at least as important or even more important than those on the committee that formally oversee the graduate work. Jackie.
I would reframe, encourage you to, the graduate student to kind of reframe this. I think if they said that, I'm considering having this individual as a member of my dissertation committee, then it seems less random. Like, okay, that might make lighter work for our department. That might be something, oh, that's interesting. Or I'm going to ask someone to co-author with you. Ask a mentor to co-author something with, and then you're working on a publication together. So I think frame it in a way that that works for you with your audience.
Any other comments there, or more generally about how one builds a network beyond the normal channels? I know it might be useful, Elizabeth, for you to recount the story of how you found the job that you have now.
Yeah. So when I knew for certain that I was moving to Cleveland and I had nothing but personal networks here, I had no professional network here at all. I just it was a combination of LinkedIn, but also finding someone at Duke who was in the business school who sort of had the connection to all of the alumni and saying, "Hey, who do you know in Cleveland?" He gave me 3 people's emails, one of whom wrote back. And from that one person, I just kind of started this snowball of networking. And when I could reach out to people and say, "This is who I am, this is what I do, I'm moving to Cleveland, and here's the timeline," I'm trying to understand the community and what I can add to it. You find that, like, just asking people to tell you about their community and their needs and what their work is a much easier lift than asking someone to, right off the bat, will you hire me? And so then they help to make those connections. And then, you find my experiences that I found, and I think other people have had the same experience, someone in the community who was really intrigued by the idea of me and, what I had to offer, and that I was moving, and said, "Okay, here are 3 paths. If I were moving to Cleveland, here, talk to this person, or this person." And like doing that, ultimately what I did is I built a network of VFA supporters in Cleveland before I knew about VFA. And they were the people who told me about it. And then when I had my first interview, and that person said, tell me about what you've been doing in Cleveland, I was really inadvertently able to say, I've been meeting with these people who are your partners, but I didn't know they were VFA's partners in the way I would come to understand later. And so I just kind of worked myself into the network very organically. And then when the opportunity came, then my ability to even do that alone was a qualification for the job. So you just keep meeting people, and it's not a hardship to ask someone to talk to you about themselves. People love to talk about themselves. You should do that.
And that took you 3 to 6 months, if I'm
That's about right. And I started probably 3 months before I moved to Cleveland, and there was certainly a difference after I moved. People really take you seriously when you've put your stuff in the moving truck in a way that they don't necessarily when you're just talking about it. But yeah, it was about 6 months.
Heather.
I was also going to say the same thing. I mean, so I think a lot of times people have a knee-jerk reaction to the term marketing. I know I certainly did when I was in graduate school, like, I'm not going to market myself. But I really see marketing as networking. And I see marketing as actually being more curious than salesy. So there's this sense that you're not trying to sell yourself. You're trying to really like be interested in people. And I think historians are naturally curious people. And so it kind of lends itself, at least, and you don't necessarily have to be an extrovert, but just go out and meet people. I have conducted countless informational interviews with people who are like, "What do you do?" And I'm like, "Come in and talk to me," and actually have ended up hiring some of those people. So I think just like explore it. Don't be afraid. I mean, who cares I shouldn't say this. I don't want to say who cares what your dissertation advisor thinks or your committee. Obviously you care, but it's your life, and the more people you meet, the more you learn, the more you're going to know what your other options are. And I see it as fun. Like, it's just fun to meet people and hear what they're working on. So just don't be afraid of that. And you never know what it's going to lead to, really.
So the theme of this panel is history PhDs, historians in the world of entrepreneurship. History as a profession and entrepreneurship are not, I think, 2 terms that at least many historians would immediately link outside perhaps the Business History Conference, which I happen to be a part of. I'm just curious for your reflections on the ways that history actually connect quite well to entrepreneurial action, and your sense of what it means to be an entrepreneur. We've been talking about this all throughout the webinar, but just how do you see that connection, and why do you think it is that for many historians they seem antithetical? Michael.
It's a really great question. I would say that, I mean, also depending on how we define entrepreneurship, I would say every historian is an entrepreneur. the dissertation itself, a project where you're interested in something, you're risking or putting resources where it's time, energy, sometimes money. You have a question in mind, you have a problem you want to solve, and there's a project or a kind of outcome which contributes to something or solves something. I think those are all aspects of something entrepreneurial. It doesn't necessarily mean starting a business, doesn't necessarily mean doing something which is traditionally associated with that, but it can mean undertaking any project and trying to solve or identify a gap, which from our historiographical training, which I often, when I talk to a lot of business professionals, I say, well, when I teach them historiography is what you guys do in market research. You find a gap in the market and you try to solve it. We do that as historians. So we just have to essentially find different ways of applying what we do as historians and acknowledging that we are entrepreneurs in a very broad sense. And how do we apply it beyond necessarily just simply academic areas? So that's what I would say.
Anyone else? Heather.
No, Jackie, go first.
Oh, please,
Okay.
Heather, you first.
So this is going to sound a little irreverent, but I studied prostitution all the way through, undergrad, master's, PhD. And what you just said about this sort of like disconnect between history and entrepreneurship, I always like to see as a lot like prostitution. You're selling a service and you have to be out there hustling and you're putting a dollar amount on your time. I know this sounds terrible, but really, as one of my colleagues just said so clearly yesterday, we're leasing our brains. We are providing a service that's related to our bodies. It's our mind and not other parts of our bodies, but and being out there and figuring out how to leverage that into a career takes entrepreneurship. And again, if there's anything I learned, it's how to value my time, that my leasing of my mental space is just as valuable, if not more, really, given the time that we spend in school and the time that we spend sort of thinking about things and developing these skills, like that's worth something. And so being entrepreneurial, and I think the disconnect again is because it's bad if you have sex for money. It's not bad if you just have sex because, right? So prostitution is vilified because of the economic connection. And I think in academic history, it's the same. There's that tinge of that. And that's where I'd like to see it as don't vilify what you do if you're selling it because it's worth something.
Jackie.
I would add that for me, entrepreneurship is it's a mindset. For me, I think of it in terms of imagination, curiosity, a different way about thinking what's possible with the resources that you have in front of you, how to best use resources, how to be agile, how to be creative. Maybe you could say entrepreneurs have a higher risk tolerance than others. That could be something that we could debate as historians, but just thinking broadly, and I don't know, just thinking about the possibilities. For me, I think anybody can be entrepreneurial in any context if they have that mindset.
And that includes within the academy, and not just in terms of developing new ideas or a different approach to a long-standing question, but also just rethinking how we organize structures and programs, and what the nature of student experience or the orchestration of faculty research looks like. Michael, any thoughts on this?
I definitely second this. And I think this is something from my experience in convincing academics that it's okay to do extra academic teaching, that you can, compared to the average, if you actually calculate the average hourly wage that most faculty adjuncts make, and that you could earn far more with the expertise and experience you have. Occasionally, very occasionally, when I try to convince academics to valorize their expertise in terms of other options, which could pay anywhere from $150 to $300 an hour, which, when you say that, often, academics' eyes light up like, oh, wow, I could make that much per hour. It's precisely getting over this stigma that what we do is if we do something our kind of craft academically, we should do it for free. And there is, a strong argument, especially from the public side, for, education as a public good. But also I think, from my own research, this is why in building this new Republic of Letters that we're doing through Polis, seeing that, the earlier Republic of Letters really encouraged a lot of people to think that, for the good of scholarship, that we don't need money, that we do it for learning's sake. But we also do need to eat. We also do need to take care of ourselves. And it's about value. It's not about, asking for more, but just simply how do we value ourselves and really taking that seriously, not saying, well, because I charge money, I might be as one of my colleagues and friends once told me, oh, well, you're just a greedy capitalist for charging money. Well, no, we all get paid for it. It's about value. It's about valuing our labor, valuing our expertise. And I think when we change that mindset and say, it's okay to be paid well and to value that expertise just as much as lawyers, doctors, engineers, and other professionals, I think we'll start to see maybe hopefully a shift in the profession.
Well, we're coming to the end of the 90 minutes. I want to thank the panelists for, I think, a really robust discussion, and invite those of you who've stayed with us through the webinar to get in touch with any one of us if you have additional questions. A long list, and we got to many of them, but there were some questions that we were not able to address in the time that we had. So would really encourage anyone who wants to follow up to do so. I want to thank the AHA for giving us a platform for this, I think, important discussion for everyone involved with the discipline of history, from undergraduates through to emeritus professors and all the other people who practice history in contexts outside of academia, whether in government agencies, firms, NGOs, or other contexts. Also just a reminder that this webinar will be available through the AHA website shortly. And so if you think there are other people who might value or benefit from the conversation, please don't hesitate to let them know that. Debbie, turn it over to you for the closing.
Thank you. I'd like to encourage, or I guess second what Ed said, and encourage people to look at our career diversity resources on the webpage, particularly the Career Contacts Program, which is a chance to either sign up for informational interviews if you're interested in learning more about working outside academia, or to sign up to be someone who people can have an informational interview with. So it's a really useful resource. A recording, as you said, the recording will be available on the AHA's YouTube channel in about a week or so. And you can also see recordings of past virtually AHA events on that channel if you're interested. And finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors again, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. Thank you for everyone, to everyone who asked questions. It was a really interesting conversation, and a special thanks to our panelists. This was a really useful and helpful panel. Thank you.